I'm joined from Washington, D.C. by Roland Martin, host and managing editor of News One Now with Roland Martin on the TV One cable network, and from Los Angeles by Peter Dreier, distinguished professor of politics and urban and environmental policy at Occidental College, who recently wrote an article on the Huffington Post titled "Martin Luther King Was a Radical, Not a Saint." It is great to have you both with us. Roland, you gave a commentary on the Tom Joyner show last week where you said you didn't want to see Dr. King trotted out like a civil rights mascot. What did you mean?
Well, what happens every year, folks talk about the dream, and so they sort of have created this mythical character as if Dr. King is defined by a single speech given on August 28th, 1963 at the March in Washington for Jobs and Freedom. In fact, most of these people haven't even bothered to read the rest of the speech. The actual original speech, the I Have a Dream portion, wasn't even in the written speech, and it was actually called Normalcy Never Again. That was the actual title of it. And so when you look at his focus after that, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, what he was focused on was economics. He was playing the Poor People's Campaign in '68. He was there for sanitation workers in Memphis in 1968 when he was killed, and that is always overlooked because people want to talk about just the dream part as opposed to the reality of what he was focused on his entire life.
And Professor Dreier, that is the point you were also making in your article, if you don't mind my opinion on what you wrote. Some of the quotes from Dr. King in that article, I would like to get your reactions to. One of them was that he said it didn't cost the nation one penny to integrate lunch counters or guarantee the right to vote. Now we're dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars and undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power. Those are pretty strong words, especially in today's world, Professor. What do you think he meant?
Dr. King began his career as a civil rights activist fighting Jim Crow, but within a few years he was a radical socialist who believed in challenging the class system, in challenging the distribution of economic power. He once said that what difference does it make if you can sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford to buy a hamburger? And he also was a critic toward the end of his life of American imperialism, of the war in Vietnam, of the defense budget and the arms race. And he said every time we drop a bomb in Vietnam, it hits home in American cities because that's money we're not spending on education, healthcare, housing, and other basic necessities.
But Roland, I want to talk a little bit more about the militarism that the professor just brought up. In April of 1967, he had a Beyond Vietnam speech, and he said there, "We as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values when machines and computers, profit and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered." He also, at another point, said that it was impossible for this to be a great nation, for us to move forward with militarism, more money being spent on militarism than on social uplift. But that has changed since then. We spend more on social uplift today than on militarism.
Right.
What do you think his position would be today?
Well, again, though, you say we spend more, but the question is what is constantly being cut as opposed to what is always being funded. Also, for anybody who's listening who say, oh, my God, I can't believe he said these things, remember, President Eisenhower gave a critical speech warning us about the military-industrial complex when he was leaving office. Not only that, Dr. King, a couple of months before he gave that speech Beyond Vietnam at Riverside Church there in New York, when he gave his drum major instinct speech. People keep missing that. They somehow think that he was talking about himself. No, that was a critical speech about foreign policy also in America. He even said the country was committing war crimes with the war in Vietnam. He also challenged white moderates, also known as liberals, saying that they were only allies for a certain period of time and then all of a sudden walked away. In his book, Chaos or Community, one of only 3 books he actually wrote, he talked about that in terms of where the Allies all of a sudden said, okay, enough has been done. He said, so when Bull Connor went away, when other evil forces went away, people said that's just about it. When he said, no, now is the beginning of the next phase. And I think we're still in that next phase.
I want the professor to address what you just brought up, the Riverside Church speech that was, and Roland brought up moderates and liberals in the white community back then. That speech was not very well received. His position on foreign policy policy was not very well received by the New York Times, by the Washington Post, by other moderate whites.
That's true. Dr. King was vilified in the media, in the mainstream media. He was attacked by J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. He was called a communist and a radical and a socialist in the mainstream media. And at the end of his life, a year before he died, Gallup did a poll and found out that 2/3 of all Americans looked at Dr. King unfavorably.
I need one last quick answer from both of you, and I want you both to address the same topic. As you're bringing up his policies and how he was a radical back then, he wasn't, though, on the extreme like a Malcolm X or a Stokely Carmichael. In fact, he thought that their black power was not necessarily a good thing. Leaders evolve. Back then, he did not approve of homosexual conduct. Gay rights was not a public issue back then. The general question I want to ask both of you is, where would he stand now, not just on that issue, but just in general? Would he be on the far left fringe, or would he be, where would he be as a black leader? Would he be Barack Obama? Would he be Bill Cosby? Would he be Al Sharpton? Roland, I'll let you go at that one first.
First of all, we have no idea where he would be. Second of all, keep in mind, 1959, Roy Wilkins, head of the NAACP, called King a radical. But the track record does say this here. Dr. King would be saying, have we achieved economic equality? White average household wealth, 100,000. African Americans, average household wealth, 5,000. That's where he would be.
Right, but the income gap, at least, is significantly smaller. But, Professor...
No, it's smaller. Well, actually, not necessarily. Again, average white household, 100,000. Average black household, 5,000. That's a $95,000 gap.
In that net worth, but on the income level, you're talking net worth. Income level, whites are about 54,000, around 55,000. Blacks in the low to mid 30s, which is a significant improvement over what it was back in the 60s. Still a dramatic difference. Unquestionably a dramatic difference. Don't mean to argue that with you, Roland. Professor, your last words? Where do you think Dr. King would be today?
Well, we have to remember that the radical ideas of one generation are often the common sense ideas of the next generation. So the idea of interracial marriage was considered taboo by most Americans just 40 years ago, and today we accept it. So I think on the issue of same-sex marriage, Dr. King would see the comparison and be a supporter of same-sex marriage today, even though he was homophobic in his own day. He evolved like many people. At the end of his life, he believed in an interracial movement of the poor and the middle class to address the issue of income distribution and poverty and power.
I got to correct your guess on one thing, calling Dr. King homophobic. He was very supportive of Bob Rustin, who was very well known, who was gay.
True.
Also, Dr. King only addressed the issue one time in a letter, so it's actually wrong based upon the facts to call him that. You don't have the evidence to actually support it.
All right. Well, the great tragedy, of course, is that we have not had a chance to see how Dr. King would have evolved over all these decades. But Peter Dreier, Roland Martin, appreciate you joining us tonight to share your thoughts.